3 times they told her no. 3 times she approached the heavy oak doors of the convent, and 3 times those doors were slammed in her face. She was a widow. Her children were gone. She had no family left, no home to return to. She had absolutely nothing, nothing, except for the burning certainty that God wanted her behind those sacred walls. But the nuns did not want her. The convent refused to let her in, and honestly, their reasons were understandable. Her husband had been brutally murdered in a bloody vendetta, a family feud that had stained the streets with red, and admitting her meant bringing that violent conflict, that chaos, right into the heart of their silent cloister. 3 times she heard the word no. 3 closed doors. 3 lonely nights returning to the crushing silence of an empty house. And then, one night, without a single hand turning a key, without a single soul inviting her in, she simply appeared inside the convent. The nuns found her at dawn, kneeling in prayer in the cloistered courtyard, as if she had always been there, as if the very walls had breathed her in. Her name was Rita, and that door, the one that opened without human hands, is the reason why millions upon millions of people cry out to her today, especially when every door in their own lives has been locked shut. This is her story. Imagine a place called Rocca Porina, a village of ancient stone, clinging to the jagged peaks of the Umbrian Apennine mountains. It's just a few miles from Cascia, but it feels like the edge of the world. Even today, barely 100 people live there, and in the 14th century, it was even smaller. Grey stone houses huddled together, shivering against the mountain cold. Dirt paths that claw their way up the hillsides, winding through skeletal olive groves and thin, struggling vineyards. The landscape is beautiful, but it is harsh. The earth here gives nothing for free. Everything, every scrap of food, every breath, is earned with sweat and toil. In that village, in the year 1381, a girl was born. Her parents named her Margherita, but the world would come to know her simply as Rita. Her parents were Antonio Lotti and Amata Ferri, humble farmers, devoted souls, known throughout the region as the peacekeepers. They weren't judges in a courtroom, no. That nickname came from their God-given ability to stand between warring neighbors in a land where family vendettas could last for generations, where a single insult was paid for in blood, and a debt was collected with a knife. Antonio and Amata were the ones who stepped into the middle of the fire. They were the ones who spoke when others screamed, the ones who listened when others plotted. They were the ones who convinced both sides to lower their weapons before the blood started to flow. Rita would inherit that gift, and God knows, she would need it. But before she inherited anything, Rita herself was a miracle. Antonio and Amata had been married for 18 years, 18 years of empty cradles, 18 years of waiting in a world where being childless was a shame and a financial death sentence. They prayed, they waited, and when no one, not even they themselves, expected anything anymore, Rita arrived, the impossible daughter, the first impossible event in a life that would become a literal chain of impossibilities. Just a few days after her baptism, something happened that history has preserved like a precious jewel. Little Rita was lying in a wicker basket at the edge of the field where her parents were working under the hot sun. Suddenly, a swarm of white bees surrounded her. These weren't ordinary bees. They were white, luminescent, as if they were made of light itself. They covered the infant without stinging her. They flew in and out of her tiny mouth, depositing sweet honey upon the lips of the newborn. A farmer passing by, his hand bleeding from a deep gash caused by a scythe, tried to wave the bees away from the child, and as his hand moved through that cloud of white wings, his wound instantly closed. Rita's first miracle. Before she could even speak, Those bees would become her symbol, appearing in the oldest paintings of the saint, alongside the thorn and the rose. Three symbols that define her entire existence: the sweetness of the honey, the agony of the thorn, and the impossible beauty of the rose. From the very moment she could think for herself, Rita wanted to belong to God. She wanted the convent. This wasn't a childish whim. It wasn't some fantasy of a little girl playing nun. It was a calling so deep, so constant, so obvious to everyone around her that even the village priest believed she was destined for the cloister. Rita prayed with an intensity that shocked the adults. She visited the church with a frequency that didn't match her age. She spoke of Jesus and the Virgin Mary with the familiarity of someone who had seen them, not just someone who had heard stories, but her parents. They had other plans. Antonio and Amata were devout, yes, but they were also 14th century peasants. And in that world, a daughter was a form of currency. A good marriage secured the family's future. It forged alliances. It sealed the peace between rival clans. And peace, in a land torn apart by blood feuds, was worth more than any vocation. They chose a husband for Rita, Paolo Ferdinando Mancini. Even the name felt like a sentence. The Mancinis were a powerful family, a feared family, deeply involved in the violent conflicts that were bleeding the countryside dry. Paolo was their son, a young man of hot blood, a man accustomed to solving problems with his fists rather than his words. He was violent. He was unfaithful. He was a heavy drinker. He was everything that Rita was not. And yet, Rita obeyed her parents, not because she was weak, but because she was obedient. And in the spirituality of that time, obedience was a virtue that was never questioned. She married Paolo. She was only 14 or 15 years old, and her dream of the convent was buried under the crushing weight of a marriage she never chose. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Which city? Which state? Which country? We get messages from all over the United States, from the Philippines, from Europe, and every time I see a new location, it moves me, because I realize these stories are reaching exactly where they need to go. So, go down to the comments, type your city and country, and then come right back. I love knowing you are there. The 18 years of Rita's marriage to Paolo Mancini were the first Calvary of her life, and one of the longest. Paolo was exactly what the records say: aggressive, unpredictable, dominated by rage like a wild horse without a bridle. The oldest traditions don't sugarcoat the truth. They speak of blows, they speak of screams, they speak of nights where Rita truly feared for her life. Paolo drank. Paolo betrayed her. Paolo brought the violence of the street brawls into their home like someone tracking mud across a clean floor. He didn't care. He didn't even notice, as if brutality was simply the natural state of things. But Rita endured, not with the passivity of someone who gives up, but with the silent strategy of someone who knows that gentleness is stronger than fury. She never struck back. She never returned an insult. She didn't even threaten to leave, though she surely could have. She did something much harder than walking away. She stayed, and she prayed. She stayed, and she served. She stayed, and she loved, with a love that wasn't a feeling, but a decision, not an emotion, but a will, not an attraction, but an offering. And she had two sons, twins, Giangiacomo Antonio and Paolo Maria, two boys growing up in a house divided, a mother pulling them toward God, and a father pulling them toward the world. Rita raised her boys in the shadow of a mountain, planting seeds of faith in the very heart of a storm. She knew that every prayer, every rosary bead, every lesson of the catechism was a fragile seedling. easily swept away by the violent winds of their father's temper. She endured Paolo with a tenacity that defied human nature, because she wasn't just raising children, she was fighting for their souls. Every single night, when the house finally fell into an uneasy silence and Paolo slept, Rita would kneel on the cold, hard kitchen floor. The beads of the rosary were pressed tight against her calloused fingers. Her eyes were closed, her voice a mere whisper that not even the stone walls could catch. She prayed for Paolo. She prayed for the conversion of a man who would surely strike her again the very next morning. She prayed with the persistence of a single drop of water that hollows out a stone, knowing the stone is hard, knowing the drop is small, and knowing the years are long. But she also knew that God listens. He always listens, even when he does not answer in the moment we demand. 18 years. For 18 long winters and 18 scorching summers, she waited, and finally, the stone yielded. Paolo surrendered. It wasn't a sudden flash of lightning. It was a slow, deliberate change, the kind of transformation that actually lasts. He abandoned the bottle. He laid down his fists. He walked away from the generational blood feud that had defined his life. He knelt before Rita and begged for her forgiveness. He reconciled his broken soul with God. The neighbors, those women who had watched Rita endure a domestic hell for 2 decades, came to her in awe. They asked, "How did you do it? How did you change him?" And Rita had only one answer, the only one she had ever known. "I prayed. For 18 years, without stopping, without giving up, without ever ceasing to believe that God could do what I could not." The conversion of Paolo was the first impossible of Rita's life made possible by grace. But the story of Rita, much like the way of the cross, offers no respite. Shortly after his conversion, Paolo was stolen from her. He was murdered, ambushed under the shroud of darkness at the tower of Collegiacone, just a few miles from Roccaporena. While he was traveling back to Cascia, the family blood feud that had poisoned his past reached out and claimed him just as he had finally escaped its grasp. The enemies of his house, perhaps the very men he had once called allies, waited in the shadows and slaughtered him. Rita was forced to receive the mangled, bloody body of her husband. This was the man who had stolen her youth, who had caused her a sea of tears, but who had, in the end, become the man she always knew he could be. He was gone, murdered, just as their life was starting to become what it should have been from the very beginning. The pain was a jagged blade in her heart, but what followed was even more terrifying. Her 2 sons, Giangiacomo Antonio and Paolo Maria, stood over their father's grave and swore revenge. They vowed to hunt down the killer. It was the ancient, brutal code of the blood feud, blood for blood, an eye for an eye. In their world, a son who does not avenge his father is a coward, a stain on the family name. These young men carried Paolo's fire in their veins, and the same rage that their father had surrendered too late. Rita looked into their eyes and saw the darkness taking root. She saw in them the same shadow she had fought in Paolo for 18 years, and she knew that if she let them follow that path, she would lose something far more precious than their lives. She would lose their eternal souls. Then Rita did the unthinkable. She did what no mother should ever have to do. She knelt before the crucifix in her home, the same Christ she had petitioned for 18 years for Paolo's soul, and she made a desperate, agonizing plea. She asked God to take her sons. She asked him to let them die, to pluck them from this world before they could commit a mortal sin, before they stained their hands with the blood of another, before the cycle of vengeance condemned them to hell forever. It is the most haunting prayer in the history of the saints, a mother begging for the death of her own children, not out of hatred, but out of a love so profound it shatters the heart. She preferred a dead, innocent son over a living, murderous one. She chose to lose them in this life so she could find them again in eternity. Heaven answered her. A fever, perhaps the same plague that ravaged Italy in those dark waves, took hold of the boys. It consumed them in mere weeks. But before the end, in a moment where God's mercy shines with a breathtaking tenderness, both boys forgave their father's killer. They died in peace. They died clean. They died exactly as Rita had begged, without the stain of blood on their souls. Rita buried them, both of them, one after the other. The widow who had lost her husband now stood over the graves of her only children. At 40 years old, she was left in a hollow house. No husband, no children, no family, no future. Just a house filled with a crushing, heavy silence. And in that silence, the vocation she had buried since she was 14 years old began to stir. It rose like Lazarus from the tomb, like a seed that finally sprouts after rotting in the dark earth, Rita realized, with the absolute certainty of those who have lost everything, that God is the only thing that can never be lost. The hour had finally come, the hour of the cloister, the hour she had waited 25 years to see. She went to the Augustinian convent of St. Mary Magdalene in Cascia. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, but the answer was no. The abbess was firm. Rita was the widow of a man killed in a blood feud. To admit her into the enclosure was to bring the war inside the walls. Paolo's kinsman might seek refuge there, or the killer's family might feel threatened. The peace of the cloister, the supreme good of a contemplative community, would be at risk. The reasons were logical. They were prudent. They were reasonable. And they were wrong. Rita returned. She knocked a second time. The answer was the same. No. She returned a third time. No. 3 times. The number that in Holy Scripture separates the one who quits from the one who persists. Peter denied the Lord 3 times and was restored 3 times. Paul asked for the thorn to be removed 3 times and received the grace to endure it. Jesus prayed 3 times in Gethsemane and accepted the cross. Rita knocked 3 times, and yet the door remained shut. But before that door could open, Rita had to do the one thing the abbess demanded, the one thing that seemed truly impossible. She had to reconcile the warring families of the blood feud. If she wanted to enter a house of peace, she had to bring peace first. It was a fool's errand. The blood feuds of 14th century Italy were not settled with words. They were settled with steel. Hatred lasted for generations, and blood always called for more blood. But Rita did what her parents, the peacekeepers, had taught her. She went from house to house. She spoke to Paolo's kinsmen. She spoke to the relatives of the assassin. She listened to their grievances. She endured their insults. When she was thrown out, she returned the next morning, and the next, and the next. She fought for peace with the same grit she used to pray for 18 years. And then, a miracle. The peace treaty was signed. The daggers were returned to the kitchens. Rita had achieved what no one in Cascia believed possible, and she had done it with no weapon but her words and her unshakable prayer. But even then, even after the fires of her old life had been reduced to ashes, the heavy oak door of the convent remained firmly shut, locked by the rigid rules of men who could not yet see the fire of God burning in her soul, until one night, a night that would forever change the history of Cascia. Tradition records this event with the stark sobriety of those who narrate a fact, not a legend, but a divine intervention. Rita was asleep in her empty house, a house that echoed with the ghosts of the husband and sons she had lost, when a voice, sharp and clear, shattered the silence. Rita, Rita, Rita. She opened her door to the cool night air, and there, standing in the moonlight, were 3 figures she recognized without a single word of introduction. St. John the Baptist, the voice crying in the wilderness; St. Augustine, the architect of her order; and St. Nicholas of Tolentino, the three protectors she had entrusted with her vocation since she was a small child. "Follow us," they commanded, and she followed. They led her through the labyrinth of the sleeping streets of Cascia, through the shadows of the stone houses, and toward the high, impenetrable walls of the monastery of Santa Maria Maddalena. They passed through those walls not because the gates were opened, but because heaven needs no keys. Divine grace knows no physical boundaries. When the sun finally began to bleed over the Apennine peaks, the nuns of the convent found a stranger within their cloister, Rita, kneeling, lost in prayer, as if she had been part of the stone and mortar for 100 years. The abbess understood. When God himself opens a door, no human bolt or padlock can keep it closed. Rita was admitted. She finally donned the black habit of the Augustinians. She was 36 years old, and she had 40 years of life ahead of her. 40 years that would become the deepest, the longest, and the most agonizingly beautiful phase of her journey toward the heart of God. But do not imagine that life inside those walls was an idyllic peace. It was a battlefield. The first thing the abbess did was to test the mettle of her soul. She ordered Rita to water a piece of dry, dead wood in the convent garden every single day. For an entire year, she was not tending a plant. She was watering a stick, a branch without roots, without buds, without the slightest hope of life. This was the test of absurd obedience, the kind of obedience that does not ask why, the kind that does not seek logic, but simply obeys because it sees the hand of God in the command. Rita obeyed every morning. Before the Italian sun could heat the stones of the cloister, she took her pitcher of water, walked to that dead piece of wood, and poured. She did it without a murmur, without a trace of irony, with the same unyielding patience she had shown during those 18 years of praying for Paolo, the patience of a woman who knows that the harvest belongs to God, not to the gardener. At the end of that year, a miracle took root. The dead stick began to swell with sap. Tiny green buds broke through the dry bark. Branches reached for the sky, and from that piece of dead wood, watered by an obedience the world would call stupid, a vibrant vine was born. A vine that, according to tradition, still grows in the garden of Cascia today. It still bears grapes. It still yields fruit, as if Rita's faithfulness was permanently engraved into the very DNA of the plant. The years in the convent were years of hiddenness. Rita did not seek the spotlight. She sought the opposite, the invisibility of a drop of water lost in the vastness of the ocean. She scrubbed the floors. She nursed the sickest sisters. She fasted with a severity that worried her superiors. She spent hours before the crucifix, motionless, her eyes fixed on the wounds of Christ as if she were reading a secret language written in his blood. Her spirituality was not an intellectual exercise. It was radical. She didn't just contemplate the passion of Christ. She knew it. She had lived it in the blows of her husband, in the deaths of her children, in the cold rejection of the world. She understood pain, and that intimacy with suffering prepared her for the final, terrifying gift. In the year 1432, a friar named Giacomo della Marca preached at the convent church. He spoke of the crowning of thorns. He spoke with such raw intensity that it ignited something within Rita that had been smoldering for decades. After the sermon, she retreated to her cell. She fell to her knees before the crucified king, and she whispered a prayer that cuts like a scalpel through the ego. "Lord, let me participate in your pain." She did not ask for comfort. She did not ask for relief. She did not ask for her own cross to be lifted. She asked for more. She wanted to share the agony of Christ, not as a metaphor, not as a pious meditation, but as a real, physical, bleeding experience. And the King of Sorrows answered her. A single thorn from the crown on the crucifix detached itself. Or perhaps it came from a realm beyond our geography, and it struck Rita in the center of her forehead. The wound opened instantly, deep, bleeding, raw. It was not the delicate, glowing mark we see in holy cards. It was a hideous sore. It suppurated. It emitted a foul odor. It was a source of revulsion to anyone who dared to look closely. The other sisters recoiled. The smell became unbearable. The wound would not heal. It wept day and night, feeding on something deeper than flesh. Rita was forced into isolation. The woman who had spent years serving others was now served from a distance, treated not with tenderness, but with the caution one gives to a leper. 15 years. Rita lived for 15 years with that open wound in her head. 15 years of constant, throbbing pain. Not the kind of pain that comes and goes, but the kind that settles into your bones and becomes your only companion. 15 years of being an outcast within her own community. Her thorn was not glorious. It was repugnant. It didn't spark admiration. It sparked discomfort. It was the passion of Christ in its most uncomfortable form. Not the majestic Christ of the cathedrals, but the disfigured Christ of Isaiah, the one from whom men hide their faces. But there is an episode that reveals the supernatural nature of this stigma. In the year 1450, the Great Jubilee was called in Rome. Rita longed to go. She wanted to walk the holy streets of the eternal city, but how could she travel with such a wound? The smell, the blood, the horror of her appearance would have made her a spectacle on the road. And then the wound closed, overnight, without explanation, without medicine. Her skin became as smooth as if the thorn had never touched her. She traveled to Rome. She prayed in the great basilicas. She participated in the holy celebrations, just another nun in the crowd, hidden, healthy, free. But the moment she returned to the gates of Cascia, the wound reopened immediately. It was as if God had lent her smooth skin for the journey. But the cross still belonged to her, and it was waiting for her return. Rita carried that thorn until the very end, with the same unbreakable patience she had carried everything else. Her marriage, her widowhood, the loss of her sons, the closed doors. Every drop of blood from her forehead was a testament that for the patroness of the impossible, suffering is not a dead end, but the very road that leads to the throne of grace. And then there was the thorn, that final sorrow, the longest, the most humiliating trial of her life. It was the ultimate culmination of a journey that began the very day those celestial bees placed honey on her newborn lips. The honey and the thorn, sweetness and excruciating pain. The life of Rita was suspended between these two poles, like a bowstring pulled tight between two extremes, with the arrow of her soul pointed directly at heaven. It was January 1457. Rita was 76 years old. Her body, a body broken by decades of fasting, of severe penance, of constant physical agony, was finally surrendering. She could barely move. She could barely whisper. The wound on her forehead remained wide open. 15 years of constant suppuration that had turned her face into a map of human suffering. A cousin from Roccaperina came to visit her at the convent. She found Rita in her cell, consumed, reduced to almost nothing, yet her eyes were alive. They were brilliant, as if behind that destroyed vessel of flesh, something was burning that refused to be extinguished. "Do you desire anything from your old home?" her cousin asked. Rita, with a voice like a fading thread, replied, "A rose from the garden." It was January, midwinter. The mountains of Umbria were buried under heavy blankets of snow. There wasn't a single flower blooming in the entire region. The cousin must have thought Rita was delirious, but she went anyway, perhaps out of love. Perhaps because no one could say no to the woman everyone already considered a living saint. She walked the 2 hours that separated Cascia from her childhood home. She reached the garden of the Lotti family. That same garden where Rita had played as a child, where the bees had once covered her in honey, and there in the middle of the snow, amidst the frost and the biting ice, she found a rose, a single rose, perfect, deep red, blooming in the freezing cold, as if winter simply did not exist, as if the seasons themselves obeyed Rita in the same way the sun would one day obey the Virgin at Fatima. The cousin cut the rose and brought it to Rita, and the tradition tells us that Rita asked for something more: figs, fresh figs in the dead of January. The cousin returned to the garden, and there, on the fig tree covered in snow, she found ripe fruit, fresh, sweet, impossible. The rose and the figs, the impossible made manifest in flower and fruit, the final miracle of a life that had been a constant defiance of what the world calls impossible. On May 22nd, 1457, Rita of Cascia died. At the moment of her passing, the wound on her forehead, which had remained open for 15 agonizing years, suddenly closed. At last, it was as if the thorn had fulfilled its mission and was no longer needed. Her skin sealed perfectly, and in place of the putrid scent the sisters had endured for 3 lustrums, her body began to exhale a fragrance, a perfume of roses, intense, unmistakable, as if that January rose had bloomed inside of Rita, and its scent was now spilling out into the entire room. The bells of the convent began to ring by themselves. No human hand touched the ropes. They pealed as if celebrating something human ears could not hear, but the bronze itself could feel. A nun with a withered arm embraced Rita's body, and her arm was healed instantly. It was the first of a waterfall of miracles, 11 verified miracles in the first 30 days after her death, 11 documented healings, 11 impossibles made possible through the intercession of a woman who had just closed her eyes. Rita's body was never buried. They placed her in a coffin of cypress wood. Years later, a fire devastated part of the convent, but the box containing Rita's body survived completely intact. Her body did not decompose, it did not corrupt, it was preserved, and it remains incorrupt to this day. Today, she is displayed in a crystal urn in the Basilica of St. Rita in Cascia. Anyone can see her. Her face is darkened by the passing centuries, but it is intact. Her hands are crossed, and on her forehead, visible still after more than 500 years, is the mark of the thorn, the wound that was her cross, her participation in the Passion, her one-way ticket to the very heart of Christ. Rita was beatified in 1627 by Pope Urban VIII, 170 years after her death. She was canonized in 1900 by Pope Leo III, another 273 years later. In total, 443 years between her death and her canonization. Almost half a millennium. Why so long? Because the Church is prudent. Because the process of canonization demands miracles verified by medical commissions, testimonies examined under oath, a theological review of every virtue. The Church prefers to be slow and right, rather than fast and wrong. And when they finally canonized Rita in the holy year of 1900, before thousands of the faithful in St. Peter's Basilica, they gave her a title that no other saint has ever held with such authority: patroness of impossible causes. Not just the patroness of the sick, not just the patroness of widows, not just the patroness of monastics. She is the patroness of the impossible, of everything that has no human solution, of everything that the doctors, the lawyers, the counselors, and the experts have declared lost. Rita is the saint you turn to when there is no one else left to turn to, because her entire life was the proof that what the world declares impossible, God declares possible today. The Basilica of St. Rita in Cascia is one of the most visited shrines in Italy, Pilgrims from every corner of the globe arrive to pray before her incorrupt body, to ask for what no one else can give them. Even in Brazil, in the city of Santa Cruz, the largest Catholic statue in the world stands in her honor, a magnificent image of Saint Rita, looking toward the horizon as if watching over all those who suffer impossibles in the vastness of the Americas. Her feast is celebrated on May 22nd. On that day, in churches all over the world, roses are blessed, the roses of Rita, the roses that bloom in January, the roses that say without words what faith says with every word in existence. The impossible exists, but God exists too. If you could enter the Basilica in Cascia today, if you could pass through the doors, walk down the center aisle, and approach the glass urn where Rita rests, you would see a small woman, darkened by time, with her hands crossed and the mark of the thorn still visible on her brow. And perhaps you would think, what a hard life, what an accumulation of sorrow, the marriage, the violence, the widowhood, the dead children, the closed doors, the thorn, the isolation, the sickness. But if you look closer, with the eyes of faith, you would see something more. You would see that every pain was followed by an impossible made possible. After 18 years with Paulo came the conversion. After the death of her sons came the forgiveness. After the 3 rejections came the door opened by no human hands. After the thorn came the January rose. After death came the incorrupt body, breathing perfume instead of decay. Rita is not the saint of pain. She is the saint of the aftermath of pain. She is the saint of what happens when suffering seems to have no meaning. And suddenly, from the very heart of that suffering, something blooms that should not be able to bloom, like a rose in the middle of January, like a vine that bursts forth from a withered, lifeless branch, like a heavy iron door that swings open wide, guided by an unseen hand. Saint Rita of Cascia, the patroness of the impossible, the woman who carried both the piercing thorn and the radiant rose, widow, mother, nun, the one who prayed for 18 long years without ever surrendering her hope, the one who knocked on 3 doors without ever losing her faith. We beg you, pray for us. Pray for those who are suffering right now, trapped in the shadows of marriages that seem beyond all remedy, in homes where the silence is heavy with unspoken pain. Pray for the mothers, the ones who weep in the middle of the night for children who have wandered far from the path, lost in the wilderness of the world. Pray for those who have exhausted every option, who have knocked on every door, only to have every single one slammed in their face. Pray for those who carry a hidden thorn, a secret sorrow that no one else sees, but that aches within them every single day without rest. Pray especially for those who have forgotten how to believe in the impossible, those who have grown cold in their spirit, and who need a rose in January to find their way back to faith. Teach us, Rita, what your life speaks louder than any book ever could. Teach us that our pain is not the final chapter of our story, that a closed door is not the last door, that the darkest hour of the night, the one that feels the most lonely, always gives way to the dawn. And teach us that where the world sees a lost cause, a soul beyond saving, a life beyond repair, God sees a rose, imperfect and beautiful, just about to bloom. Amen. If this journey through the life of Saint Rita, the saint of the thorn and the rose, has touched your heart today, I ask you for 3 small things that help us continue this sacred mission of storytelling. First, please give this video a like. It is that small thumb icon located right below this screen. When you click it, you are doing more than just pressing a button. You are telling the YouTube algorithm that this message of faith matters, and the system will then carry this story to more people who are currently desperate to hear it. Second, share this message. Think of one family member, one friend, or one person you know who is currently carrying a heavy cross, send it to them directly via text or WhatsApp. Just tap that share button next to the like. Sometimes a single message shared at the exact right moment can be the miracle that changes someone's life forever. And third, if you feel moved and are able, you will see a button labeled Thanks with a small heart icon. This is the super thanks. By clicking it, you can make a small, voluntary contribution of any amount you choose, which goes directly to support this channel. This support is what allows us to keep producing these cinematic journeys, to dedicate dozens of hours to every script, and to bring the light of faith into homes across the entire world. It is never obligatory, but if you can help, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for your time and your devotion. And may Saint Rita of Cascia, the miraculous patroness of the impossible, intercede for you and for everyone you love. We will see you in the next video.